Hello! Welcome to West Virginia University's Humanities Center's new video series on the intersections in the humanities and sciences. My name is Gwen, and today we'll be chatting about the workshop, how it is used, and why we should be taking notes from diverse fields of study when considering how to shape our workshops in the classroom. First off, let's think about what the workshop is, because this phrase tends to strike fear. Put simply, the workshop is a process that describes a collaborative writing method in which a person drafts their work, which may include anything from essays to presentations to lab reports, then provides that work to a peer group. The author then receives the edits, integrates those edits, and we see some change in the work. This whole process is a continual cycle, as we understand a work to be, to some degree, continually living. The goal of using a workshop model is to use outside resources to improve upon work, and this is a broad goal, encompassing assessment on how well a work achieves field conventions to assessments of the literary success of a work. This variation in goal tends to lead to some style variation, which we're going to discuss today via comparison of the science workshop and the creative writing workshop. Through this comparison, we're going to see two wildly different classroom settings and consider how we use interdisciplinary techniques to address strengths and weaknesses in these workshops. Further, we consider the relationship between the workshopper, the person giving review and suggesting edits, and the workshopee, the person who provides the work and accepts edits. Looking to our workshop cycle, we're going to begin after the work has been drafted and consider how students receive their peer work. At this stage, an outside student is asked to read another student's work to assess it. As I've mentioned before, there are many differences between the science workshop and the creative writing workshop, and it's at the peer review that we see those first major differences. At left, we see the science workshop's traits, and creative writing is at right. First, let us consider the background of a student assessing this work. In the sciences, we generally have STEM students critiquing other STEM students, and I use this acronym purposefully here, as it encompasses the broad range of peers in many lower-level introductory courses, where we see the lab report and peer review implemented. In this room, we have everyone from aspiring healthcare workers to bench scientists to engineers, all with varied goals in their education, both in the classroom and more broadly. On top of this, these students are working with the conventions of primary literature while having minimal background in reading it. These conventions are often presented, but unclear without a certain degree of inundation with the literature. Contrast that with the creative writing workshop. These workshops are full of students who, to some degree or another, consider themselves writers. While there is still no homogeny due to personal background, there is still a very clear common ground that is far more uniting than simply being involved in STEM. Further, in these courses, students are expected to interact with existing literature via essays, stories, or poems as appropriate for the focus of the course. These readings give them access to the conventions of writing, as well as how they may vary. Looking at the nuts and bolts of this process, we see another difference. Science workshops are very fast. Readings are done in the classroom, often sitting beside the creator. Students are given up to 15 minutes to read and create a response to their peer. In the creative writing, we see the readings done outside of class, usually as homework. A student can take as much or as little time as they please to read the work, consider the response, and craft it. Jumping ahead just slightly into the receiving of edits, the creative writing workshopper will generally write out responses either as margin notes or in a crafted response letter. There is a clear expectation to come to the workshop with some thoughts on the work. In the ways that we see the science workshop work, we become aware of what the goal is. In this setting, students are assessing how well a work achieves conventions. Often this leaves little room to consider the quality of the work or respond to larger challenges a work may face. It also leaves little space for the workshopper to fully complement a work. Often these workshops feel very fast and leave the workshopee with little new thoughts. Alternately, the creative writing workshopper is expected to give an analysis of the full piece, what is working and what is not, and how those traits can be amplified or changed. However, this can be a far more nebulous goal, with different workshoppers having different thoughts on what that means. This brings us into how a workshopee receives edits. We see this delineation between review and reception because these are two separate processes. In the previous step, the workshopper considered the work and formed an opinion. The workshopee does not yet have that information. Here, we examine the exchange of the workshopper's thoughts to the workshopee. Like I mentioned before, a creative writing workshop response often has a written element. Whether this looks like margin notes, a letter to the author, or just a pros and cons list, the workshopper brings this work to the classroom, and at some point the workshopee will receive that written work. Alternately, the science workshop, due to its speed, features an oral response, which tend to be far less specific than a written response. In writing the response, a workshopper can call out specific instances of a critique. They also have room to assess the whole work, while an oral response may be shortened to not feel like a rant against the work. Which brings us to a perspective shift. What is being critiqued? Most classrooms would agree that the work is being critiqued, but the form a critique takes can shift the focus to feel like it is on the workshopee. In a written response, there is a clear focus on the work itself. There is a danger that in oral forms, we tend to use the phrase, "you say," where the "you" references the workshopee. This places pressure on the workshopee to not take these critiques personally, which is already difficult in a workshop setting. Shifting into the classroom setting, I asked us to consider what the workshop looks like in both classrooms. In the science classroom, students are one-on-one, sharing what they think about a piece. With only one voice on the piece, any critiques hold little power. There's also no room for an alternative view. Contrast this with the creative writing room, which uses a round table, frequently, quite literally, a circle of peers approach. A diverse group of writers respond to the same piece, giving insights to others as well as alternative views. These workshops are driven by the discussion of the piece, assessing many parts of the work. The way we assess a work, then receive those edits, shape how we integrate those thoughts into a work. When a creative writer receives written feedback, they can return to their work later and address what feedback is to keep and what feedback is to ignore. A scientist only has those oral responses and whatever notes they took on those oral responses, frequently leaving them only with the feeling of being critiqued. So when the author goes to make changes to their work, the creative writing workshop has given a more tangible series of notes. However, consider the goal of the science workshop. How does the piece address conventions? When we consider the goals of a workshop, we must also consider the desired change to a work. What does it mean to improve? Before we finish off with an integration of workshop practices, I'd like to consider where the workshop comes from. The guilds. Historically, a master worked with apprentices in their workshop to train young people into capable craftsmen. Those apprentices may have spent time in between apprenticeship and mastery as a journeyman, but the hope was eventually to become a master and bring up their own apprentices. This implies a need for mastery in the workshop setting. Are we including that in our workshop? I'd like to close by suggesting a more interdisciplinary approach to a workshop. By addressing both sides, we consider what works, and understand that the world of literature has grown to define their workshop into a successful space. Therefore, I present a workshop that favors the conventions of literature and creative writing. First, we must always consider the goal of the workshop. And this is where the scientists win out. The goal of a science workshop is vivid. The strength of this in the science workshop is incredibly valuable and lays the foundation for peer review in an individual's future. Be aware of goals in a workshop. Make it abundantly clear to the people in the room. Making a work better isn't easy, especially as students grow throughout their education. A goal makes it clear to a student at any level what they're looking for, laying a foundation for young students and directing veteran workshoppers. While the scientists win out with a clear goal, this should be equally applied in the creative writing classroom by asking a few questions of a piece before workshopping occurs. Namely, Where is this draft in its process? Is it an early draft? Has it been workshopped before? Is it nearing completion and ready for publication? Considering where a work is and what it needs gives the workshopper a starting point. A work that is an early draft likely needs more focus on its structure, while a later draft needs a more detailed assessment of the line level writing. Second, be aware of what a student knows about the world a work exists in and the contextualization of the workshop itself. We absolutely cannot expect STEM students to understand how their lab report is intended to look if they've never read a lab report or primary literature before. Just as we cannot expect creative writers to understand craft elements without seeing them in use. Integrating readings with the works is important because it gives students time to understand what it is they're participating in, where conventions are coming from, and how those conventions are shaped and vary within the genre. We also need to consider how these workshops are set up. Are students only relying on other students? In the creative writing workshop, they are not. A teacher, who is the master in this setting, works alongside their apprentices to improve a work. Giving students free rein over each other's work seldom leads to tangible progress, both through a lack of leadership modeling the workshop process and through a power dynamic that pits students against each other in the workshop. Without placing an experienced voice in the workshop, students feel as if it is the workshopee versus the workshopper, which is the antithesis of the goal of the workshop. Third, we consider how students receive their critiques. Critique is difficult, as we are human, and to an extent, there will always be feelings involved. To the previous point about workshopper versus workshopee, we need to mitigate this feeling. We also need to mitigate the frustration of receiving edits. We are attached to our works, and giving critique inherently says, you should change something, whether we agree about it or not. On the flip side, it is never ever helpful to provide, this was good, as the only response to a work. Good is an incredibly imprecise statement. Teaching students how to respond to their peers is important to help all of this. Remember that specificity allows for more clear critique, whether a workshopper is suggesting an edit or complementing the work. This is a continuation of the role of the master. As a master of a field, teachers are more keenly aware of what is expected or what works. Presenting oneself as an example gives students space to learn more about a workshop. Last, and most importantly, the workshop requires time. Reading takes time. Responding takes time. Expecting a workshop to exist in 15-minute time slots does no one justice. It leads to frustrating experiences for everyone. Give your students time to respond to each other. The creative writing workshop takes hours when one considers reading time, discussion, and editing. We are lucky to exist in an era of technology, and more workshops would benefit from its use. While it may be minimal time in the classroom for these practices, there may be a space for it to fit outside of the classroom. Thank you so much for watching. I hope we've sparked some interest in considering the workshop through an interdisciplinary lens, and that they lead to exciting, helpful, and impactful workshops in your future. If you have any questions, you can direct them to the Humanities Center at humanitiescenter@mail.wvu.edu. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next video.